tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Speaking of which, we'll talk about the ballooning size of government, and it's actually a rather natural segue because government tends to just spend money that it doesn't have, that isn't its own, and not do it in a particularly efficient way. I mentioned that they've spent $42 million without confiscating a single gun, but you know that money is going towards staff. They're administering a bureaucracy. They're commissioning reports. They're doing all of this stuff that government does that private sector enterprise would never want to do, nor would it be able to get away with doing it. But it times well with this report that came out from the Fraser Institute just on how large government has gotten. And this is not just a federal problem, but you see it at the provincial level as well. A new study says that from 2007 to 2022, government spending in 8 out of 10 provinces, so 80% of the country in terms of provinces, went up. Government spending increased in these provinces, and also public sector employment rose, not just in 8 out of 10, but rose across the board in all provinces. So government is getting fatter and more costly, even if we have a lot of economic situations in that would not necessarily support such growth. Jake Fuss is back with us. He is the Fiscal Studies Director for the Fraser Institute. Jake, always good to have you on. Thanks for coming back today.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me on.
So just to talk about what is at stake here and what you're seeing, is this the normal growth to keep up with growth in the country, or is this a disproportionate growth that you're tracking here?
Yeah, what we're seeing is that the size of government as measured by spending is growing faster than the Canadian economy, like you mentioned, in 8 out of 10 provinces, but also nationally. So when we're looking at local, provincial, and federal levels of government, we're now seeing government spending representing more than 40% of the Canadian economy, whereas it was about 37% in 2007. So there's been a pretty substantial increase in government spending as a share of the economy over the last 15 years or so. And it's been a pretty much across the board change in all provinces across Canada, except for PEI and Saskatchewan, which saw small declines in the size of government in that 2007 to 2022 period.
Do you know what it is that accounts for that, for those two?
It's a good question. There have been some changes over time. So I think some of it might have to do with some changes during the pandemic as well, because generally we were seeing, Saskatchewan actually had a higher spending in 2019 than it does in 2022, for instance. So there might be some certain temporary programs being removed or other things. So we'll have to keep track of Saskatchewan and Prince Edward Island over the long run to see if this is actually a trend or just a blip on the radar. But in PEI's case, even though they had a declining size of government, their size of government is still about 58% of the size of the economy, for instance. Whereas a province like Alberta, which, yes, increased in terms of size of government, their size of government is about 27% the size of the economy. So there's a marked difference here between a lot of the provinces in Canada, especially Western provinces compared to Eastern provinces. We're generally seeing smaller governments in Western Canada relative to Eastern Canada.
Obviously, in that range, a couple of events I think have to be noted here. 2007 and 2022, you've got the 2008 recession, and we know that was just an example for government shoving money out the door as quickly as they could. You also mentioned the pandemic, another situation in which governments were racking up insane amounts of spending. How much do those, if at all, skew the overall trajectory you're looking at?
I think they definitely have an impact. I mean, especially when you look at the 2020 COVID pandemic, for instance, you do see a huge spike in government size during that time. But what was interesting is that it basically became a permanent increase, maybe not to the levels that we saw at the height of the COVID pandemic, but we basically had a permanent increase in the size of government between 2019 and 2022. So that really tells us that, yes, COVID does have an impact, but governments are actually just increasing in size over time anyways. We had 7 out of 10 provinces increase their size of government between that 3-year period between 2019 and 2022. And of course, the financial crisis in 2008 also has an impact on the size of government as well. But in the years when you're winding down temporary programs or other things, we're still seeing that permanent ramp up in government spending. That really has nothing to do with the pandemic. It's just simply increased bureaucracy, increased government spending over time.
Yeah, and I was kind of curious about the public sector growth. Now, I know this study isn't doing a public-private sector contrast, but I think we do know that private sector employment is not immune to economic trends. Private sector employers that don't have a taxpayer to lean on have to make very difficult decisions. They all slash their workforce, well, not all, but many of them slash their workforces during COVID. But we see a continual increase in, as we were talking about earlier, every single level of government, every single province here over that span.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, essentially, what we've seen from 2007 to 2022 is an increased share of the workforce employed in the public sector, for instance.
So not just raw numbers; it's the share that's going up. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's basically growing faster than private sector employment, for instance. So if we look at 2007, about 19% of total employment in Canada was in the public sector. Now in 2022, it's about 21%. And we've seen that across the board in all provinces. All 10 provinces had increases in public sector employment relative to total employment in Canada. So yes, private sector employment is still increasing over time, but it's not growing as fast as public sector employment is what these numbers show us.
One of the challenges, and I know it's going outside the scope of this study, but you can look at these numbers, and again, just to pull them out here, in Nova Scotia, government's size relative to the economy, 63%, and in Alberta, 26.8%. So, even if it's going up in Alberta, it's still nowhere near the size in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada generally. So, if you're looking at this as a taxpayer, not an economist, and you're trying to figure out what's the sweet spot, is there a sweet spot? Is there a size that it should be or is supposed to be?
Yes. So we know from empirical research that generally the optimal size of government is generally between 26 to 30% of the size of the economy. And this is when you get historically maximizing your economic growth rates. When you start to exceed these levels, and you can actually start hindering your economy. And then you can ultimately start hindering living standards for citizens as well. So Alberta is the only province that is actually within that optimal range of 26 to 30%. All other provinces are well above 30%. In fact, most provinces are well above 40%, and some of them are even exceeding 50 or 60%. So they're well above that optimal range. And they're at that point where they're likely harming their economies and harming the living standards in those provinces as well, rather than helping the citizens by having that optimal range of government in that 26 to 30% of the size of the economy.
It's actually quite interesting. So I wasn't familiar with that data you referenced. So basically, we do see an inverse relationship between size of government and overall economic prosperity or health.
Yeah, exactly. And that analysis is based on a whole bunch of OECD countries, very advanced countries around the world. And it's a historical analysis. You can even extend the analysis a little bit more if you want to punch it out a little bit more to about 24 to 32% of the size of the economy. But generally what we've seen is that these countries around the world have actually maximized their growth rates when it is within that range. So it provides a good barometer for governments to actually track their progress and to ultimately see, is there ways that we can actually improve economic growth? And can we address this through government spending as the size of our economy? Are we too high, too low? Are we in the optimal range? And I think that's an important metric for governments to track over the long term.
So if we took the national picture here, Canada has government at 40.5% the size of the economy. What's needed to take that down to that range that we're talking about?
Well, it's certainly a complicated question because it's not just one level of government. When we're looking at the federal level of government, we also have provincial governments and local governments included in that. So really, it's a cohesive effort between all three levels of government to actually track their progress on this. Right now, we're really seeing an explosion in government spending and debt at really all levels of government. And that's certainly a concern moving forward. So I think it's going to be important and imperative for governments to begin to review the amount of spending, what they're spending on. Are we getting value for this money? Is this actually leading to economic growth? Is it leading to improved living standards for Canadians? Because right now what we're really seeing is economic stagnation, and we're not seeing those improved living standards for Canadians. And just because we have more government spending isn't necessarily leading to better results for us. So I think we need to rethink what we're ultimately doing on government spending as a share of the economy, and what we're spending this money on too.
All right. Well, fascinating numbers. As always, Jake Fuss, Director of Fiscal Studies for the Fraser Institute. Thanks so much, sir.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.